Right now, tonight, a Category 5 typhoon is bearing down on 200,000 Americans. Not in the abstract future. Not a forecast cone on a map you'll forget by morning. Sinlaku, upgraded in the last 24 hours to the highest classification a storm can carry, is moving directly toward the Mariana Islands with sustained winds at 167 miles per hour. That is not a number for a graphic. That is the strongest storm currently rotating anywhere on Earth. The National Weather Service has 302 active weather alerts across every U.S. territory and state right now. 2 of them carry the designation Extreme. Both belong to Sinlaku, not one for the Marianas and one somewhere else. Both. The entire extreme tier of the U.S. alert system is occupied by a single storm aimed at a single island chain most Americans couldn't locate on a map. That last part is not incidental. It is the story. Because here is the loop that keeps turning. The Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Rota, and the chain running north through the Pacific sit inside the most violent stretch of ocean on the planet, and they keep getting hit. Super Typhoon Yutu in 2018, Typhoon Mawar in 2023, now Sinlaku. These are not bad luck events spaced decades apart. They are a compressing pattern, each one arriving before the last one's damage is fully repaired, each one landing on infrastructure that is still fractured from the storm before it. Yutu in 2018 was the strongest storm to make landfall on U.S. soil in recorded history. Full stop. Stronger at landfall than any hurricane that ever hit Florida, Texas, or Louisiana. And the response, the recovery timeline, the mainland attention, none of it matched that fact. Then Mawar hit in 2023 and knocked out power to 98% of the island. Not a regional outage, 98%. 2 years later, pieces of that grid are still unfinished. And this morning, before Sinlaku even arrives, a magnitude 5.0 earthquake shook the same island chain. So this is the situation as the storm makes its final approach. 200,000 Americans on remote Pacific islands, living on infrastructure damaged twice in 6 years, shaken by an earthquake today, with a Category 5 hours out and nowhere to go. No mainland to evacuate to, no interstate to drive away on, just the islands, the shelters, and whatever the next 48 hours bring. To understand why this keeps happening, why this specific chain absorbs these storms at this intensity, you need to know who actually lives here, and why the distance that makes these islands feel remote to the mainland is exactly what makes each storm so catastrophic when it lands. Start with the simplest fact, the one that should make this a national story. Every person in the path of this storm is an American citizen, not a territory in the colonial era sense of a legal footnote. A citizen. They carry U.S. passports. They serve in the U.S. military at one of the highest rates of any population in the country. They pay into federal systems. And tonight, the strongest storm on Earth is aimed directly at them. The Mariana Islands are 2 separate U.S. jurisdictions. Guam, the southernmost and largest, has roughly 160,000 people. A full-service American community with a hospital, a university, a naval base that sits at the forward edge of U.S. Pacific power projection. Then to the north, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, the CNMI, 14 islands, about 50,000 people, the largest of which is Saipan. The names that come up in World War II history, Tinian, Rota, Saipan. The airfields the B-29s flew from to reach Japan, the beaches where some of the Pacific War's bloodiest landings happened. Americans died here in the tens of thousands to hold these islands. Then the islands became U.S. territory, and then, largely, the mainland stopped thinking about them. That's not an accusation, it's a geography problem with a visibility consequence. The Marianas sit about 6,000 miles west of Los Angeles, closer to Manila than to Honolulu. When the news cycle runs on proximity and cable cameras, 6,000 miles is effectively invisible. A hurricane aimed at Miami triggers wall-to-wall coverage 3 days out. A Category 5 typhoon aimed at the same number of American citizens in the Western Pacific gets a scroll at the bottom of the screen, if that. The people here are not a homogeneous group. Guam has a majority Chamorro population, indigenous Pacific Islanders whose ancestry on this island goes back 4,000 years. The CNMI has significant Carolinian and Filipino communities. There are military families, federal workers, retirees. What they share across those differences is this. When a Category 5 hits, there is no driving to a cousin's house 3 states over. There is no highway to higher ground in another jurisdiction. The island is the island. If the shelters hold, you live. If they don't, the options shrink very fast. And that isolation, the same isolation that makes these islands feel distant on a map, is what amplifies every storm into a different category of disaster than what the wind speed alone would suggest. Because after the wind stops, you are still on a small island in the middle of the Pacific, and everything that was broken is still broken, and the supply ship is still days away. The distance that makes the mainland forget is the same distance that makes recovery so brutally slow. Which means to understand what Sinlaku is about to do, you need to understand what 167 miles per hour actually does to the place people live. 167 miles per hour, that number has been in the air since Act 1, and it's time to make it real. Start with a concrete object. A standard concrete block wall, the kind that forms the exterior of most residential construction in the Marianas, built specifically because wood frame houses learned their lesson decades ago. At 74 miles per hour, that wall is fine. At 110, it starts to matter. At 167, the wind is not pushing against the wall. It is finding every gap, every imperfection, every unsealed joint, and it is pressurizing the interior of the building like a pump. The roof doesn't blow off from above. It blows off from below. The pressure differential between inside and outside lifts it. And the moment the roof goes, the walls follow within seconds, because a concrete wall with no roof to brace it is just 4 separate slabs waiting to fall. Now the road. Typhoon-force winds don't just make roads impassable while the storm is happening. They load them with debris, corrugated metal roofing traveling at 60-70 miles per hour, utility poles horizontal, trees stripped to bare trunks with the root balls exposed and the soil around them saturated by the rain bands that precede the eye wall. After the storm, a road on a small island is not a road anymore, it is a sorting problem. Every piece of that debris has to be moved before emergency vehicles can reach the people who need them, and on an island where the National Guard is not pre-positioned from the mainland, that sorting happens with whatever equipment didn't get destroyed. The human body at 167 miles per hour, walking outside is not survivable. The wind speed required to knock an average adult off their feet is somewhere around 50 miles per hour. At 100, unsecured objects become projectiles. A loose 2x4 hits with more force than a car crash at freeway speed. At 167, the air itself is the weapon. The flying debris doesn't have to be large. A bottle cap, a piece of gravel. At that velocity, it penetrates. This is why shelter-in-place orders are absolute, and why the shelters themselves, the ones that hold, are not optional infrastructure. They are the only option. And the power grid? The Marianas run on above-ground transmission infrastructure, lines, poles, transformers. In a Category 5, these do not bend. They fail. Every single one. The question after the storm is not whether there is power. There isn't. The question is how long until the first line is back, and then how many weeks until something approaching normal coverage is restored. After Mawar in 2023, nearly the entire grid went dark. After Yutu in 2018, some communities waited months. Months. Without power on a tropical island, the cascade starts fast. Water treatment fails, refrigeration fails, medical equipment fails. The wind is ours. What the wind breaks takes years. Sinlaku is not a hypothetical. It is a position on a map, moving at a known speed, toward a known target. And right now, that map is not ambiguous. The storm is tracking west-northwest across the western Pacific, aimed directly at the Mariana Island chain. The National Weather Service has issued its highest tier designations, Extreme, for the alerts covering this system. To understand what that means, consider the scale. There are currently 302 active weather alerts across all U.S. territories and states. 2 of them carry the extreme designation. Both belong to Sinlaku. Not one other storm system anywhere in the United States right now has earned that classification. Every tornado watch, every flood advisory, every coastal high surf warning, none of them sit at the top of that tier. Sinlaku sits there alone, twice. The forecast track puts the most dangerous portion of the storm, the eye wall, where those 167-mile-per-hour winds are concentrated, passing directly over or very near the northern islands of the chain within the next 24 to 48 hours. The exact landfall window carries the uncertainty any tropical forecast carries at range, but the cone is narrowed. The islands are in it. Saipan and Tinian, the 2 most populous islands in the chain, sit in the path. Combined, they hold the vast majority of the Marianas' 200,000 residents. These are not people who can drive inland. There is no inland. The island of Saipan is roughly 12 miles long. You cannot outrun a typhoon on 12 miles of road. You go to a shelter and you wait. The next 24 hours follow a sequence that residents here have learned to read. First, the outer bands arrive. Heavy rain, gusts climbing toward tropical storm force, the light going strange and flat. Then the wind climbs and stops gusting and just becomes a constant roar. Then the eye wall. The eye wall is not a gust. It is sustained. At 167 miles per hour, sustained for potentially an hour or more depending on the storm's speed of movement. Then briefly, the eye, a disorienting calm that has killed people who walked outside thinking it was over. Then the back eye wall, just as violent, from the opposite direction, which is often what finishes off structures that survived the first pass. On a grid that was already incomplete before Sinlaku formed, on roads that were already cracked, on roofs that were already patched with whatever was available after Mawar, that second eye wall matters. What the first pass weakens, the second pass takes. This is what the next 48 hours look like on the ground. The storm is already there, in the forecast, in the alerts, in the 2 red designations sitting alone at the top of every active weather warning in the United States. The question the Marianas have been forced to ask, again, is not whether they can stop it, it is whether anything will be standing when it passes. They have asked that question before, and the last time the answer came back, it came back in numbers that rewrote the record books. October 25th, 2018, Super Typhoon Yutu made landfall on Saipan and Tinian with sustained winds of 180 miles per hour. Not 167, 180. It is, by official measurement, the strongest tropical cyclone ever to strike United States soil at the moment of landfall. Stronger than anything that has hit Florida, Texas, the Gulf Coast, or the eastern seaboard in recorded history. The strongest storm to touch American ground. And it hit an island most Americans cannot find on a map. What 180 miles per hour winds do is not a weather event. It is closer to demolition. Concrete block homes, the standard construction on Saipan, precisely because they are built to survive typhoons, had their roofs peeled off or their walls punched through. Corrugated metal roofing became airborne shrapnel. Trees did not bend. They snapped at the base, where they were uprooted entirely, root ball and all, and thrown. The northern villages of Saipan took the direct eyewall hit. Tinian, the smaller island just south, took nearly the same. Utilities went down island-wide within the first hour of landfall. They would not come back, not fully, for months. The official count afterward, roughly 90% of structures on Saipan sustained damage. Somewhere between a quarter and a third were destroyed outright or declared uninhabitable. Thousands of people lost their homes in a place where you cannot simply drive to a shelter in the next county. There is no next county. There is open ocean in every direction. President Trump issued a major disaster declaration for the Northern Mariana Islands. Federal assistance did arrive, but the pace of it and the scale of it did not match what a storm of that magnitude would have triggered on the mainland. Temporary blue FEMA tarps became a fixture on rooftops across Saipan, not for weeks, but for years. When Typhoon Mawar arrived in 2023, some of those tarps were still there, because the permanent repairs had not happened yet. That is the ghost that haunts Yutu, not the storm itself, which ended in hours. The ghost is the 5-year tail it left, the housing that was never fully rebuilt, the power infrastructure that was patched rather than replaced, the families that relocated to the mainland and did not come back, the population that thinned because the island could not guarantee them a stable place to live. When the National Weather Service issues a forecast track for Sinlaku and overlays it on the Marianas, it is not overlaying it on islands that recovered from Yutu. It is overlaying it on islands that are still recovering. That distinction is the difference between a disaster and a compounding one. And Sinlaku is not arriving into a clean slate. It is arriving into a wound that never fully closed. Then came Mawar. May 2023, less than 5 years after Yutu had stripped the islands to their foundations, a second major typhoon made a direct pass over Guam. Mawar was not as catastrophically violent as Yutu at landfall, but it didn't need to be, because the infrastructure it hit was already compromised. The power grid that Yutu had shattered had been patched, not rebuilt. The poles were up. The lines were strung. But the underlying architecture was still fragile, still aging, still relying on a transmission system that predated both storms. Mawar found every weakness. When it was over, 98% of Guam's power grid was gone. Not damaged, gone. Nearly the entire island, dark in a single night. To understand what that number means, stop thinking about inconvenience and start thinking about systems. No power means no water pumping at scale. Most of the island's water infrastructure depends on electric pumps. No power means hospitals on generator fuel they can't replenish because the fuel supply chain is also disrupted. No power means no refrigeration, which means food spoilage inside 48 hours, which means a population of 150,000 people facing a supply crisis while they're still pulling debris off their roofs. The recovery from Mawar took months, not weeks. Parts of the island were without stable electricity well into the fall of 2023. And when federal disaster declarations came through and contractor crews arrived to begin the grid rebuild, they were not starting from a clean blueprint. They were inheriting a repair on top of a repair on top of a system that hadn't been fundamentally modernized since before the era of Category 5 storms hitting these islands with regularity. That work is still unfinished. As of this storm, Sinlaku, bearing down right now. Portions of the hardening and resilience projects funded after Mawar are incomplete. New underground cabling, upgraded substations, backup generation capacity. The timeline for those projects runs past where Sinlaku is sitting on the forecast map. So here's the compounding math. Yutu weakened the grid. Mawar erased 98% of it. The rebuild is partial, and Sinlaku, a Category 5, is arriving before the work is done. This is what it looks like when a region absorbs sequential catastrophes faster than it can recover from them. Not a disaster. A disaster hitting a previous disaster's scar. And the storm does not care how much of the grid is new and how much is still waiting on a contractor's schedule. The wind hits everything the same. And then, this morning, the ground moved. A magnitude 5.0 earthquake struck the Mariana Islands today. The same chain already bracing for a Category 5 typhoon, still running on a partially rebuilt grid, still carrying structural damage from 2 storms in the last 7 years. A 5.0 is not a catastrophic earthquake by itself. Buildings designed for seismic load handle it, infrastructure rated for it survives. But these islands are not starting from a baseline of healthy infrastructure. They are starting from a baseline that Yutu cracked and Mawar hammered, and a contractor's backlog has only partially repaired. That is the difference between additive and multiplicative disaster. In a system that is intact, a 5.0 shakes things and moves on. In a system already compromised, water mains with stress fractures, retaining walls with latent cracks, power substations rebuilt fast under emergency contracts, a 5.0 finds every weakness that the last 2 storms introduced and pulls on it. The damage is not earthquake damage plus storm damage. It is earthquake damage amplifying storm damage, which was already amplifying the unfinished recovery from the storm before that. There is a term in disaster science for what happens when catastrophes arrive before recovery is complete. Cascading failure. The idea is that each event lowers the threshold for the next one to cause serious harm. You do not need a second earthquake as powerful as the first. You do not need a second storm as powerful as Yutu. You just need another event, any event, to hit a system whose margin has already been spent. The Mariana Islands have spent their margin, multiple times over. And tonight, with the ground still settling from this morning's quake, a Category 5 is tracking directly toward them. The wind does not negotiate with a cracked foundation. The surge does not pause at a repaired seawall. What the earthquake loosened, the typhoon will find. So why here? Why the same narrow chain of islands, over and over, absorbing storms that would be historic events anywhere else on the planet? The Mariana Islands sit at roughly 15 degrees north latitude, in the western Pacific. And that address is, from a meteorological standpoint, one of the most punishing pieces of real estate on Earth. To understand why, you have to understand where typhoons come from and where they go to die. Tropical cyclones need 3 things to grow: warm ocean water, low wind shear between atmospheric layers, and enough distance from the equator for the Coriolis effect to spin them up. The Western Pacific delivers all 3 in extraordinary concentration. The basin is vast, the surface temperatures are among the highest on the planet, and the thermocline, the depth to which that warm water extends, is deeper here than almost anywhere else. A storm crossing this water doesn't just get warm fuel. It gets a column of warm fuel that doesn't run out. The Marianas sit at the end of that runway. Storms that form in the open Pacific, anywhere from the Philippines to the international dateline, organize and intensify over thousands of miles of open water. And then the chain is simply there, in the way at exactly the latitude where late development storms reach peak intensity before turning north. The islands don't attract typhoons. They just cannot get out of the path of them. The Western Pacific generates roughly 25 to 30 named storms per year, more than any other basin on Earth. Of those, the ones that develop along the low-latitude belt and track westward have the Marianas directly in their corridor. Guam alone has absorbed more major typhoon strikes per square mile than virtually any other inhabited landmass on the planet over the last century. Now factor in what climate science is showing about the trend. The storms are not necessarily becoming more frequent. The data on raw storm count is mixed, but the storms that do form are intensifying faster, reaching higher peak winds and maintaining that intensity closer to landfall than they did 30 years ago. Warmer ocean basins mean more energy available at the moment a storm makes its final approach. A storm that might have weakened to a Category 3 before reaching land in 1990 now arrives as a Category 5. The window between warning and landfall is the same. The destruction at the end of that window is not. There is no forecast where this changes. The ocean basin keeps warming. The thermocline keeps deepening. The Mariana Islands stay exactly where they are. The corridor does not move. What changes is only the strength of what arrives inside it. So the corridor doesn't move, the storms keep arriving stronger, and the people in their path are American citizens. Which raises the question the last 2 acts were quietly building toward. What does the United States actually do for them? Here is the documented record. When Hurricane Ian made landfall in Florida in 2022, FEMA had pre-positioned hundreds of personnel and millions of dollars in supplies before the storm crossed the coast. The National Guard was mobilized. The president made a personal call to the governor. Cable news ran wall-to-wall coverage for 4 days. The federal machinery moved at full speed because the machinery knew where to look. The Marianas sit 7,000 miles from Washington. They have no electoral votes. Their delegates to Congress hold non-voting status. They are, in the formal architecture of American political power, merely invisible. And that invisibility has real consequences when a Category 5 is 48 hours out. After Super Typhoon Yutu in 2018, the strongest storm to ever strike U.S. soil at landfall, stronger than any hurricane in recorded American history, FEMA did respond, eventually. But the logistics of responding to an island in the Western Pacific are categorically different from responding to Florida or Texas or Puerto Rico, which at least sits in the Atlantic. Supplies have to be air freighted or shipped across an ocean. Contractors willing to work in a remote territory are scarce. Federal disaster declarations came, but the money moved slowly. A 2021 Government Accountability Office report documented persistent gaps in disaster preparedness for Pacific Island territories, inadequate pre-positioned supplies, staffing shortfalls at local emergency management agencies, and federal coordination frameworks that were designed with the continental United States in mind. The report was filed. The gaps remain. When Typhoon Mawar hit in 2023, 98% of Guam lost power. The island was still running on partial grid capacity when Sinlaku formed. That is not a coincidence of bad luck. It is what happens when rebuilding timelines stretch for years and the next storm doesn't wait for them to finish. The gap is not malice. It is geometry, logistics, and a political structure that allocates attention where votes concentrate. But for the person in Saipan boarding up windows tonight, the explanation doesn't change the math. The strongest storms on Earth keep arriving here, and the full weight of the federal response that would mobilize instantly for Miami takes weeks to reach them, if it reaches them whole at all. The wind stops, and that is when the real clock starts. A Category 5 typhoon is measured in hours, 12, maybe 18, from first landfall to the trailing edge of the outer bands. The damage it leaves behind is measured in something else entirely. After Yutu in 2018, the recovery timeline on Saipan ran past 2 years. After Mawar in 2023, Guam was still operating on a fractured grid when Sinlaku formed in the Western Pacific. The storm is the event. The aftermath is the sentence. Water goes first. Not just flooding, the infrastructure that delivers clean water. Pump stations lose power. Pipes crack under debris impact or ground shift. Cisterns that families depend on get contaminated by storm surge. Within 48 hours of a direct Cat 5 hit, the thing most likely to kill someone on a remote Pacific island is not wind. It is what comes out of the tap. Disease follows the water. Leptospirosis from floodwater. Gastrointestinal illness from compromised wells. Dengue spikes when standing water breeds mosquitoes in the wreckage of homes. These are not hypotheticals. They are the documented pattern from Yutu, from Mawar, from every major typhoon that has moved through this corridor in the last 3 decades. The medical infrastructure that would respond to those surges is itself inside the damage zone. Then the supply chain problem hits. The Mariana Islands import the vast majority of their food and fuel. A major typhoon doesn't just damage the port. It can close it for days or weeks. What's on the shelf before the storm is what exists until a ship can dock. For an island of tens of thousands of people, that math turns dangerous inside of a week. Mental health is the thing no cable segment ever covers. Post-disaster psychological trauma in communities that absorb repeated catastrophic storms and have no mainland to relocate to is severe and chronic. Yutu left visible PTSD across Saipan. Children who lived through it are now old enough to board up their own windows for Sinlaku. That is not a metaphor. It is a generation that has never known a storm season without an existential threat attached to it. And then comes the forgetting. This is the most predictable part of the cycle. The news cycle moves within 10 days. Federal attention follows the news cycle. Funding that was pledged in the immediate aftermath gets slow-walked through bureaucratic channels while the island tries to function on emergency power and bottled water. Mawar proved it. Yutu proved it before that. The forgetting isn't sudden. It's a slow fade, week by week, until the islands are invisible again, exactly as they were before the storm hit. The wind stops in hours, the debt it leaves, in broken infrastructure, in contaminated water, in a mental health crisis no one is funding, in a supply chain that still hasn't fully healed from last time. That debt compounds. And the next storm doesn't wait for it to be paid. But while that debt compounds, someone is still on the island. They didn't leave. Most of them couldn't. There is no mainland for a Chamorro family in Saipan. No aunt's house in a safer state. No highway out. no option to load the car and drive until the storm is behind you. When the evacuation order comes, the question isn't which direction, it's which room, which interior wall, which mattress to pull over the children. Some residents have ridden out 4, 5, 6 major storms in a single lifetime. They know the drill with the intimacy of someone who has rebuilt the same roof more than once. You fill every container you own with water because the tap won't work for weeks. You move the generator to the highest spot you can reach because the surge will come and the generator is everything. You mark where the structural walls are, the ones that held last time, the ones you trust. You take photographs of your property before the wind arrives because the insurance claim will require them and the storm doesn't care whether you remember. The people who cannot shelter in place at all, the elderly, the medically dependent, the ones in the houses that didn't survive Mawar, go to designated shelters. Schools built to a hardened standard, government buildings, concrete structures that have held before and might hold again. They bring what fits in a bag and they wait. And then the wind arrives. Not the movie version, the real version. A Category 5 doesn't announce itself with a gust. It builds over hours into a sustained roar that makes conversation impossible, that makes the walls flex, that turns debris into projectiles traveling faster than highway traffic. People describe it as the sound of the island being torn open. The eye passes. For an hour, sometimes 2, it goes completely still. Children go outside. Adults check on neighbors. And then the back wall hits, sometimes stronger than the front, and it starts again from the other direction. What keeps people here isn't stubbornness, it's that this is home. The Chamorro people have been on these islands for 4,000 years. They were here before the colonial powers arrived, before the military bases, before the cable news cycles that forget them. They have survived occupations and wars and storms that don't have names yet. The Category 5 bearing down tonight is the latest in a very long line of things this community has absorbed and rebuilt from. That resilience is real. It is also not a substitute for the resources, the infrastructure, and the sustained federal attention that would make surviving a little less brutal and rebuilding a little less slow. Tonight, they are riding it out. The way they always have, the way they shouldn't always have to. Sinlaku is not an anomaly. That is the thing this whole video has been building toward, and it is worth saying plainly now that the storm is almost there. Yutu in 2018, Mawar in 2023, Sinlaku in 2025. 3 catastrophic storms in 7 years. And before Yutu there were others, and before those there were others. The Mariana Islands do not sit in the path of the occasional disaster. They sit in the most active typhoon corridor on Earth, at a time when the storms feeding off that corridor are getting stronger, faster, and harder to recover from before the next one arrives. The infrastructure Yutu destroyed was still being rebuilt when Mawar hit. The grid Mawar erased was still unfinished when the ground shook this morning. And now Sinlaku is making landfall on top of all of it. That is not bad luck. That is a system, a geographic, climatic, and political system that keeps delivering Category 5 force to islands that cannot fully absorb it, cannot fully recover from it, and cannot escape it. And a system has solutions. It requires investment, structural reform, pre-positioned resources, and a federal government that treats these 200,000 Americans as if the zip code at the end of their address does not determine how much their lives are worth. Right now, somewhere on Saipan or Tinian or Rota, someone is in a shelter, listening to wind that sounds like a freight train trying to tear the walls apart. They made a calculation tonight, not because they are fearless, but because there was nowhere else to go. Their home is the island. The island is in the storm's path. So they stayed, and they braced, and they are doing what people in the Marianas have always done, surviving something that should not be survivable on these terms. When the wind stops, and it will stop, the cameras will move on. The news cycle will find the next thing. The cable news scroll will update, and the Mariana Islands will begin, again, the long, exhausting work of digging out, powering up, rebuilding, and waiting. They deserve better than that cycle. Not sympathy, resources. Not a scroll, a policy. Not recognition after the next storm kills the power for a year, recognition now, before Sinlaku's replacement is already forming over warm water somewhere east of the Philippines. These are American islands. These are American citizens. And the strongest storms on Earth keep finding them. The question is not whether another storm is coming. The question is whether, when it does, anything will be different.